Good morning, students. I hope that you are doing well. So, as we are talking about today's session, so no doubt we would be covering the new topic for you, the consideration. But before we proceed with today's session, I would like to discuss about that what we have done earlier. As you know that this is the subject, business law. So, what about the business law and what are the contents of business law? And as per the study, what you have to do or what kind of the acts you have to study as we are continuing the Contract Act 1872. So now you are familiar with the different terminologies of this business law and different concepts now you are familiar with. And I think that after discussion of the essential of valid contract, now you are familiar that how to enter into a valid contract and what are the essentials of valid contract. Because today, as we are talking about the consideration, that is also essential of valid contract. But before that, you proceed with the consideration. Once again, this is the time to give a focus on the essential of valid contract, because there are a number of essentials. There are a number of essentials of a valid contract, as offer and acceptance, free consent, and lawful object, and capacity of parties, and consideration. Right. So different essentials are there, and already a few essentials we have discussed in the previous lectures. So today it is the time to discuss about the consideration. It is ingredient of valid contract. So what is the consideration and what is the role of the consideration when one party is entering into a particular contract? So it is very important to focus on the consideration, because if you are not aware of the consideration or if you are not focusing on the consideration, it means maybe you are not entering into a valid contract. So in order to constitute a valid contract, it is very important, or it is imperative to have the knowledge of the consideration as being the integral part of any valid contract. So what is the consideration and what is the role, what is the importance of this particular essential of valid contract? We should know that what is consideration. Consideration is one of the essential elements, as I told you, of the valid contract. Without having this particular essential as a part of the valid contract, the agreement cannot be enforced by the law. A consideration is reward for a promise. As we know that offeror is there, promiser or promisee you can say. So when the parties are entering into a particular contract, that time there should be the consideration for both the parties, or there should be a particular reward or a price you can say for the promise. So consideration is the price, consideration is the reward or the promise, right? So this is very important when you are entering into a contract, that both the parties should have something of the value, or we can say that there should be something which the particular law attaches the value of, right? So if there is no any value in return of your promise, if there is no any reward, there is no any price for the promise, so that particular contract cannot be enforced, or that agreement cannot be enforced by the law. So consideration, if we want to say that, what is that? Consideration is the reward for the promise. Consideration is the price, right? Or consideration is something in return of your promise. As you are making the promise to someone under a particular contract, it means you are willing in return something. So what is the value of that something? That is the consideration. I am not talking about that adequacy should be there, because the law is not talking about the adequacy or the amount of the consideration, but there should be something of the value in return of your promise. So consideration is a reward, and as per the definition, the act, or as you can see, abstinence or promise which forms the consideration for promise must be done as at the desire of promisor. What is the sense of this particular statement? It means the consideration is an act. It means if one party is willing that another party should do something in return of something, so that is the particular act. So consideration may be an act, or consideration may be the abstinence. Abstinence, what is the meaning of the abstinence? It means the another party is willing that you should not do any particular act in a particular situation. So if there is a abstinence, there is any act, or there is a promise in a future, right, for any act, so that is the meaning of the consideration. It means there are three components of the consideration. The very first, as I told you, that it may be any act, it may be any abstinence, right, from anything, or the promise for the future. So these are the components of the consideration, and it must be done, right? If you are making any promise or for a particular consideration, so consideration should move at the desire of the promiser, as per the willingness of the promiser. This is noteworthy that if anyone is doing any act, right, despite there is no any willingness of the promiser is not wishing for that, but voluntarily if anyone is doing any act, so that time it will not amount to consideration, it will not amount to the valid consideration or valid contract, because there is no particular desire of the promiser for that act, or for the abstinence, or for that kind of the promise in the future. So it is must to be a valid consideration that it should be as per the requirement of promisor, right? And it must be done by the promisee or any other person. It is not mandatory that suppose there are two parties, and there is a particular contract between two parties, and if third party is playing a role while it comes to consideration, or is paying anything in the form of the consideration, or is doing any act in the form of the consideration, so it is immaterial that who is furnishing the consideration, who is furnishing that. So it is very, very important to understand that consideration may be done by anyone else other than the parties who are entering into a particular context. So we can say that third party can also meet the obligation on behalf of the promise, right? It may have been already executed, or is in the process of being done, or maybe still executed. So it is also important to have the sense of the consideration in the terms of present, past and future, because the consideration may be in present, past and future. So what is the meaning of the past or present or executory or executed? So further I will be discussing about it. But right now you should have you should know about the consideration, that consideration is what, and consideration may be in present and past and future, and may be done at the desire of the promiser, or must be done at the desire of the promiser, and it must be of something to which the law attaches the value of. As I told you that the law is not asking you that you should go for adequacy or for the particular amount, because the parties are free to make their bargains, right? It means, for an example, suppose any party is selling or is proposing to sell a motor cycle or a bicycle for a particular amount, suppose worth rupees 20,000, and the party is willing to sell for rupees 5,000. So it is not necessary that consideration should be of the same value as one is paying for it. So there should be a particular value, right? There should be value, the something should be there for the consideration or to constitute the consideration, but it is not mandatory that the same value should be there. So it must be of something to which the law attaches a particular value. As we are talking about the essentials of a valid consideration, so consideration must move at the desire of promisor, as I told you earlier, that voluntarily if there is any act, or voluntarily if anything is being done without asking to do so from the promisor, so promisor is not liable to pay for it, right? For an example, suppose Mr. A and Mr. B are there, two parties, and Mr. A sees that there is a fire on the house of Mr. B, and Mr. A just give the support to extinguish the fire on the house of Mr. B without asking to do so. But after some time, if A wants some money for it because he rendered that services to extinguish the fire, so in that case, if you think that the A will be supported by the court, so what do you think? Because there is a consideration or no. So on the basis of the consideration, if we see that what is the validity of the contract, you will find that there is the particular role of the consideration, but because there is a voluntary act, the B is not asking to render the help by Mr. A, and voluntary act was done by Mr. A. So we can say that there is no role of consideration. There was no consideration. So B cannot, A cannot enforce or cannot get that particular contract enforced by Mr. B, right? Second point, if we talk about, the consideration may move from promisee or any other person, as I told you that third party can also meet the obligation on behalf of any party. So it is not compulsory or mandatory that the particular consideration should move by anyone who are entering into the contract. So this is the point, that this is a very important point, that consideration may move from any other party also, maybe third party. And consideration may be past, present or future, and consideration must be something of value. So if there are some essentials of valid consideration, and you have noticed and you are keeping in your mind that once you are entering into a contract and to constitute or to form a particular constitution while having these particular essentials, your contract would be valid contract. Now step by step we go ahead. Consideration must move at the desire of the promisor. In order to constitute the legal consideration, the act or abstinence forming the consideration for promise must be done at the desire or request of the promisor. As I told you that the act should not be voluntarily be done. Acts done or services rendered voluntarily or at the desire of third party will not amount to valid consideration. Consideration may move from the promisee or any other person. As already we have discussed, but this is to remind that the consideration need not move from the promisee alone, but may proceed from a third person. So we just take the example for your understanding. Suppose there is a case that two parties are entering into a particular contract. For example, there is a lady, right? And that lady is making a gift to her daughter, right? And the daughter is compelled that to pay a particular annuity to Mr. B, right, as an uncle of that daughter. So if the daughter of A thinks about that there is no consideration because the gift was made by her mother, and now the annuity is to be paid annually to Mr. B, as he is the uncle of that particular girl. So if you think that there is no consideration, or the girl thinks that there is no consideration, so consideration is there because the consideration has been given by Miss A or Mrs. A, right? So you can say that there is a particular role of the consideration, and without consideration, if you think that there is a contract, there is no contract. But in this case study, there is a consideration. Directly the consideration is not made by the Mr. B, but on behalf of Mr. B, Mrs. A is paying the consideration. So there is a particular valid contract, and the annuity would be paid by the daughter of Mrs. A. Okay, so it is immaterial who has furnished it. On the behalf of the promisee, the third party can pay the consideration. And consideration may be past, present, or future. Consideration may consist a past, present, or future act, or abstinence. Abstinence, as I told you, that you are asked not to do something, right, or to any act. Past consideration, when something is done or suffered before the date of the agreement. Suppose parties are entering into a particular contract with the agreement, and before the date of the agreement, if there is any particular act at the desire of the promisor, because there is a condition. So at the desire of the promisor, if something is done or suffered, that is known as the consideration, and it would be treated as the past consideration. And what about the present consideration? As I told you, that consideration moves simultaneously, right? If you are entering into a contract, right, and any act is done by one party, okay, but that is the executed, it means another party is not meeting his obligation. So one party has done the particular act, and the second party or the another party is not completing the act. So that time we can say that is the executory. So at the option of one party, it is done. It is you can say that this is the particular consideration, or you can say that is the executed consideration. But another party is not meeting the obligation, or maybe in future it will be done. So that part is the executory. So that is called the present consideration. Yes, it is to be noted here that if both the parties are meeting their role and meeting their obligations simultaneously, and the promises made by each person have been made, so that time we can say that is the executed contract. That is not the executory, because in the case of the executory, one party has completed the role, but the second party is not meeting the obligation, and the act is not done right till now. So that is the executory, and maybe in the future it will be done. So that is the case of the present consideration, when the particular one act is executed, and at the option of another one, it is executory, right? And what about the future consideration? So when the consideration on both the sides have moved at future date, or will move at future date, it would be treated as the future consideration or executory consideration. As the fourth essential, that is very important, that consideration must be something of value. As already we have discussed that the consideration need not be adequate to the promise for the validity of the agreement. It means if there is a particular case that one party is making the consideration, and in return, if the same amount you are willing that the same amount should be there in order to form or to constitute the consideration, so it is not required by the law, because there should be the consideration of something or few values, or not adequacy. So adequacy is not required. We are not considering the adequacy. The law only insists on the presence of the consideration, right, and not on the adequacy of it. So it is very important that if you are entering into a contract and you are considering that what kind of the consideration we should have, so it should be focused that we are not talking about the adequacy, because the court is not asking you that you should pay the adequate amount to the particular promise, but there should be some value, or the court will try to attach the value to your promise. There should be something, right? It leaves the people free to make their own bargains. As I take the example of motorcycle, because if the motorcycle worth rupees 20,000 is being sold for rupees 5,000. So this is on the part of the parties that they both agree for the amount. So there is a consideration of rupees 5,000 for the promise. So we can say that the particular contract is a valid contract. And consideration must be real, right? If there is an uncertain consideration or there is no reality or impossibility exists there, so where consideration is physically impossible, if the illegal consideration is there, illegal act is there, or consideration is uncertain, it means you cannot identify that what kind of the consideration we are talking about. So, or illusory is there, it is not real and therefore shall not be valid consideration, and in the lack of the these essentials or the consideration, the particular contract should not be a valid contract and will not amount to a valid contract. So it is very important to have the understanding of the valid consideration, because if you want to form the valid contract, it is must to have a valid consideration, and consideration may be of something value, and consideration may be present, past and future, and consideration must be moved at the desire of the promisee, and there should not be the voluntary act, as I took the particular example of the fire on the house. So we are discussing about that what kind of the consideration should be there once you are entering into a contract, because it is the important essential of the valid contract. Yes, there are three components, as I discussed, that the consideration should consist any act or abstinence or the promise for the future, right? Yes, this is the time to discuss that sometimes if there is no consideration, because generally it is said if there is no consideration, no contract, but there are some exceptions, and to this particular rule, no consideration, no contract. So consideration being one of the essential elements of a valid contract, the general rule is that an agreement made without the consideration is void. Void, as I told you, this is the term of the business law. It means both the parties cannot go to the court for making any contract enforceable by the law. You cannot go for the enforcement, right? But there are a few exceptions to the rule where an agreement without consideration will be perfectly valid and will be binding both the parties, right? So there are some exceptions, and further we will be discussing about it one by one. Agreement made on account of natural love and affection, section 25, subsection 1. If a particular contract you are entering into, and that contract is made on account of natural love and affection, for an example, if the gift is presented by any party, so there is no need of the consideration. If anyone is giving the gift to someone, so that time if you think that consideration is not there and there would be no validity of contract, no, it is not like that. Because few contracts are there where we are not requiring, or the law is not requiring the particular consideration or the amount of the consideration, but it should be kept in the mind that agreement should be of a particular nature, and that is on account of the natural love and affection. But if there is a particular contract which is related to this particular point, so it should be, or it should consist of these few points. The first is the expressed in writing. So if any gift is being made by anyone to someone, so that time writing that particular contract should be written over there and the registered, and it should be registered in any particular law, and made on account of natural love and affection, right? It means it should be induced by love and affection, and there should be a particular relationship between both the parties, right? And the near relation to each other, right? So these are the points, and on the basis of these points we can say that the agreement made on account of natural love and affection definitely will amount to a valid contract. Agreement to compensate for past voluntary service, right? A promise made without consideration is also valid, right? How? if it is a promise to compensate wholly or as a part. For example, A finds B's purse wallet and gives it to him. B promises to give A rupees 500. This is a contract. It means A is finding a particular wallet or purse, right, of any party, and the party is making a promise, and that particular act was done earlier, and now the second party has made the promise to pay for it, and the first party is asking for the particular amount in return. So if the in this case, if the B is thinking that we should not give in the return as a consideration, so it is not good, because B promises to give A rupees 500, and it is the particular voluntary act, but because there is a contract that B has made the promise for the consideration, so there is a valid contract, and A can go for getting this particular contract enforced by the law. Now we come to next point, that is the agreement to pay a time barred debt. What is the time barred debt? As you must be aware of that the time barred debt, it means, as per the particular law of limitation, the particular debt which cannot be recovered, as we know, because there is a particular limitation of the time, and one can approach to the court to recover the debt, and that particular time has barred. So this is a debt which has been barred by the law of limitation. The agreement is valid even though it is not supported by any consideration, right? But it should be in writing and signed by the debtor, right? Because the debtor is ready to pay a particular debt, right? Once the time has barred as per the law of limitation, and debtor wants to pay the money to the creditor, so in that case again there is a matter of the contract, and there is a valid contract. So this is the exceptions to the law that there is no consideration and no contract, so it would be a valid contract. Now we talk about the contract of agency. So in the case of the agency, section 185, it has been described by the Contract Act that there is no requirement of consideration in the case of the agency or for a particular business. So this is also exceptions to the law. Remission by the promisee of performance of the promisee. For compromising a due debt, suppose there is a particular amount which is to be paid by the debtor, right? And if the creditor is taking the decision just to accept the less amount than what is due, so if the party is going to be agreed to receive the less amount, so that time there is no need of the consideration, there is no need for a valid consideration over there. So this is also the exception when the remission by the promisee of performance of the promise. The next case is the contribution to charity. If the charity is made over there, right, a promise to contribute to charity, though gratuitous, would be enforceable if on the faith of the promise subscription, the promisee takes definite steps in furtherance of the project and undertakes a particular liability. So what about this? We just take the understanding of it. Suppose there is a case of the contribution to charity. If someone wants to make the charity to someone and has promised that I will pay you this particular amount in the form of the charity, and on the basis of that particular promise of the charity, the second party who is expecting that the charity would be given by the first party to him, and take some steps in order to form a particular project or in furtherance of any project, right, or take some liability or make some expenses also. So that time liability is there on the shoulder of the second party, and that particular decision to for the furtherance of any project has been taken by second party on the basis or on the faith of the promise of first party. So in that case there is no need of the consideration, and it would be treated as a valid contract. Familiar with all the concept of the consideration, what about the consideration and what kind of the consideration should be over there. Because if you want that a particular contract should take the form of the valid contract, we need some essentials, as already we have discussed about that. There should be the offer and acceptance, and in a particular lecture I have told you that there should be a particular kind of the offer, because if offer is not valid, there should be no valid contract, because void contract is there and valid contract is there. So we need to form a particular valid contract, and we need to have the essentials of the valid contract in mind when we are going to enter into a particular contract. And as today we took the session about the consideration. So consideration is must, and without consideration, if we leave aside the particular exceptions to the law, there is no consideration, no contract. But there is a requirement of the consideration when we want the valid contract, or we want to constitute the valid contract. So in order to make a valid contract, there are some rules and regulations as per the law, as per the Contract Act 1872, as the consideration is must, and it should move at the desire of the promisor, because voluntary act is done so that there would be no particular valid contract. So we have to keep in our mind that any act, any abstinence or the promise in future definitely will form a particular consideration, and consideration may be present, past and future, and consideration may move from third party also, and it is not mandatory that promisor or promisee will make the contribution on their behalf. Any third party can also move the consideration or pay the consideration, and consideration should be of something value, and it should not be of the adequate amount, because the particular law doesn't insist on the amount of the consideration, but there is a particular requirement that there should be something in value. So consideration as a price, consideration as a reward, definitely consideration is must for a valid contract. So I think through this particular concept now you are familiar with the very important essential of the valid contract. Thank you very much.